First, I want to start off by saying I'm appreciative of the opportunity to stand before you again and present a lesson. I don't know what everybody else's experience is like, but when Brother Gary is on a mission to sign some people up to teach, for me, he has a little more of a pep in his step, right? And he plops down, he's got that little grin on his face. It may not be how it happens, but that's how I remember it. And, he comes and talks to me sometimes about random things. But you knew that Sunday morning when he comes and is asking you to teach a lesson, that's exactly what he wanted. And I am appreciative of the opportunity, although as nervous as it may get some who don't stand up here often. This morning, the lesson is on Omniscience. And I was looking through the book that Brother Gary provides us, and there were two that caught my eye right off the bat. Omniscience, and to be honest with you, I can't even remember the second one right now, but it was more of a clear cut and concise and not easy, but more straightforward. Omniscience can be a little deep and involved, and Kelly was sitting there looking through the book with me, and she said, just do Omniscience. Go big or go home. And part of me is wishing I was still at home this morning, but here we are, and I've learned a lot from this study, and I hope you'll learn a lot of it too. There are some things about God that we'll just never wrap our minds around. I think the biggest thing for me is the fact that he had no beginning. You know, we can kind of conceptualize eternity in the future, having no end. You know, we have some idea of the concept of immortality and things like that. But everything for us has a beginning. You know, even in sci-fi movies where they depict characters who are immortal or are just going to live forever, they at least had a beginning before their unending life. And that's one of the things that strikes me as just hard to comprehend. And I think it's supposed to be that way because we're not supposed to understand everything about God. Also in Exodus, when God is speaking to Moses through the burning bush, and Moses asks, "Who shall I tell the people that you are?" He replies with a statement, "I am who I am." And if you think about that long enough, you kind of say, okay, but what does that doesn't really tell me anything. You know, if I'm meeting Brother Chris for the first time, and he says, "Good morning, I'm Brother Chris," and I said, "Nice to meet you. I am who I am." He might look at me a little puzzled and say, "Okay, but that doesn't really tell me anything about you. Tell me a little more. You know, of course you are who you are, but tell me a little more." But with God, that statement is sufficient, even if we can't fully comprehend it. There's so much involved in that statement, so much behind that statement that we don't fully understand. And God knows that we can't fully understand. He went on to further give a more simplistic explanation to Moses of what to tell the Israelites in a way that they could understand. You know, another thing is that Jesus was 100% man and 100% God. You know, and I enjoy math and was a math teacher for a while, and going into accounting, another math and involved field. You know, and for me, 100% and 100%, that's 200%. That's too many percents, right? But for God, that's just how it is. And we will never fully understand, at least not in this lifetime, everything there is to know about every subject. And omniscience is one of those. It gets a little deep, but we can still have a good understanding of the attributes of God, and omniscience being one of them. Omniscience, our word omniscience, is derived from the Latin combining omnis, which means all, and scire, I believe, I'm not 100% on that pronunciation, but meaning to know. Some common definitions of omniscience are all-knowing, having infinite knowledge, knowing all things, infinite understanding, and perfect knowledge. In Psalm 33, verses 13 through 15, the Bible says, "The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all the children of man. From where he sits enthroned, he looks out on all the inhabitants of the earth. He who fashions the hearts of them all and observes all their deeds." One writer put it quite plainly, he knows everything about everything that is knowable. God, however, did not acquire his knowledge as man does. This is alluded to in Isaiah 40, verses 13 through 14. "Who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, or what man shows him counsel? Whom did he consult, and who made him understand? Who taught him the path of justice, and taught him knowledge and showed him the way of understanding? And the answer to all these questions is nobody. No man can teach God what he knows or what he needs to know or what he should know like we learn. God does not learn through the process of learning, experience, or observation. His knowledge just is, and it always has been. In Isaiah 46, verses 9 through 10, the Bible says, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God, there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." There's a quote, and I'll use a couple of these throughout the lesson just because they put it so articulately, more so than I could, by Thomas Ralston, who was a Methodist, but this quote was used in some of the sources, some of the lectureship books that we have in the library, and it was included in there, so I felt comfortable including it in this lesson as well. But it's a good, solid statement on this subject. It says, "The infinite knowledge of God not only comprehends everything, great and small, whether animate or inanimate, material or immaterial, throughout the immensity of space, but also throughout the infinite periods of duration. All things, past and future, are just as clearly seen and as fully comprehended by the omniscient God as the plainest events of the present." Now, I was talking with Chad about, just asking him a couple questions about this lesson, and he explained to me one way he had heard it put is that all of time from the beginning, from creation to whenever the end of the world will occur, is on a mural. And we are just living in that mural in the present. We can't see, we know of the things that are past, but we weren't there to experience them. We're just living in the present, and those are the only things that we can observe. But to God, he can see it all. He just stands in front and takes it all in, and it just is. There is no point A, point B, point C, because he's not constricted by time. Now, he has an understanding of time because he has to talk to us in that manner, because that's how we live our lives, by time. But he's not constricted in the same way that we are. The things that he sees in the early days are the same things. He sees them just as clearly as in the future. So all this simply means that God foresees what man will freely do or not do. And we'll dive into that a little more as we go along. First, I want to start by looking at some passages in the Bible that have to do with omniscience. There's three categories that I want to look at. The first is God knows all things. And I'll ask for some volunteers. And there were a lot of verses in the lesson. I think this category alone had probably 20 some odd, and I tried to narrow it down for time's sake, and it was hard to do even that, narrowing it down to 4 in this category. But God knows all things. 4 verses I want to look at. If I could get volunteers for the first 3, and then I'll cover the last one in Romans. Brother Chris said he'll take the first one. You can go ahead.
Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed.
All right, thank you very much. The Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him all actions are weighed. 1 Kings 8:39. Somebody has that, Brother Ricky? All right, thank you. For you alone know the hearts of all the sons of men. Okay, and I think everybody that has lived, is living now, and is going to live is a son of man. So God knows all the hearts of man, all those past, present, and future. Matthew 10:29 through 30. Go ahead.
Are not 2 sparrows sown in the garden, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered.
You know, this one was kind of a sobering verse when I read it. If God knows, he obviously knows everything, but he even here specifically states that I know when a sparrow will fall to the ground. I know all the hairs on a person's head, which seems like an unimportant detail, to us. But if he knows even those seemingly unimportant details, just imagine all of the important things about our daily lives and the way of the world that he does know. The last one is Romans 11:33. Says, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways." And inscrutable, I kind of had an idea of what it meant, but I'm not the best wordsmith. But it basically means impossible to understand. That was one of the definitions I found when I looked up the word. How impossible to understand are his ways. Next category here on omniscience is God sees all things. If I could get a couple more. Chris, I don't know if you're still in 1 Samuel or if you left. Sorry, I meant to tell you that. 1 Samuel 16:7. If I can get some others turning to Job and Hebrews. Okay.
Okay, 1 Samuel 16:7. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart."
All right, thank you. Job 34, 21 through 22. Brother Gary. 21.
For his eyes are on the ways of man, and he sees all his steps. There is no darkness nor shadow of death, where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves.
All right, thank you. Sees all the ways of man and all his steps. There's nowhere that you can hide from the Lord. Hebrews 4:13.
Neither is there any creature that is not manifest in his sight, but all things are naked and open unto the eyes of him with whom we have to do.
All right, thank you very much. So God sees all things. Lastly, his infinite understanding. 1 Chronicles 28, verse 9 reads, "And you, Solomon my son, know the God of your father, and serve him with a whole heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches the heart and understands every plan and thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever." Understands every plan and thought. The key to take out of that verse. Somebody have Psalm 147:5.
Great is our Lord and mighty in power. His understanding is infinite.
Thank you. Understanding is infinite. And Isaiah 40:28.
Have you not known, have you not heard, the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, neither faint nor weary, his understanding is unsearchable.
All right, thank you. So those are some of the key concepts behind the idea of omniscience. Foreknowledge is one of the ones that is a big part of omniscience, because foreknowledge, a knowledge of the future, is not something that we can have, something only God can have. We can understand past events, we can have knowledge of past events, but foreknowledge is something only obtainable by the all-knowing God. This word from the Greek prognosis literally means before knowledge, and we get our modern-day medical word, that means to forecast or predict, because that's all we are able to do, is to forecast or predict. We cannot know for certain the future like God can. Another quote by Henry Thyssen says, "God is infinite in knowledge. He knows himself and all other things perfectly from all eternity, whether they be actual or merely possible, whether they be past, present, or future. He knows things immediately, simultaneously, exhaustively, and truly. God knows the future. From man's standpoint, God's knowledge of the future is foreknowledge, but for God's standpoint, it is not, since he knows all things by one simultaneous intuition." And what that means to me, especially the last bit, where it says, from man's standpoint, God's knowledge of the future is foreknowledge. It's kind of accommodating language for us so that we have an idea of the concept. But remember, he doesn't see these as kind of a future events. These events just are. They will occur. They have occurred, in his eyes. And he just gives us more of that accommodating language so that we're better able to understand these things. One important distinction to make, and we'll get into this more later as well, is that foreknowledge does not necessarily mean, and oftentimes does not mean, foreordination, or does not mean that God caused these things to happen. And that's a lot of the objections or misconceptions about the topic of omniscience and foreknowledge come from mixing these two things together. Foreknowledge is just the knowing of an action, where foreordination is the planning or the causing of an action. So I want to get into some examples first of what foreknowledge is. In Genesis 18, God says of Abraham, "For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken." He starts the verse off by saying, "I know him," Abraham. And then he says, "He will command," which means he hasn't done this yet. So God had to have known that he will do this when given the opportunity. And Chad just wrapped up a kind of a series on providence. And providence and foreknowledge are definitely intertwined, in my opinion, from this study and from hearing Chad's lessons. God had to know that when given the opportunity, that Abraham would lead his family in the way of right, would do the will of the Father. You know, a couple weeks back, I think a couple Wednesdays back, he talked about having the open doors. And if this opportunity was presented to Abraham, what would he choose? Well, he would choose to obey the commands of the Lord. If this door was presented to Abraham and he chose otherwise, to turn his back or to not follow his commands, God's providence wouldn't have led him to use Abraham for his purpose. But knowing, we said in this quote earlier by Henry Thyssen, whether they be actual or merely possible, knowing all the possible things that could happen when an individual is presented with a choice, allows God to use those individuals in his plan, knowing in the end what they will choose. Another one is Moses and Pharaoh in Exodus 3:19 through 20. The verse reads, "But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. For I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go." You know, and sometimes maybe somebody's trying to play devil's advocate, and they say, well, why didn't God just start off with the 10th plague, with the killing of the firstborn, right? That one was the one that ultimately led to their release, and he could have saved a lot of time and a lot of heartache for everybody. Instead of going through those first 9 and then ending on the 10th, why don't you just do the 10th one first? And we don't know all the reasons, but God knows all the reasons. He knows all things, again, that are actual or merely possible. You know, he may have known that Pharaoh, if he had started with killing the firstborn, that wouldn't have been enough. It had to take all those other 9 that led up to that point in order to convince him enough to heed the words of Moses and let his people go. Josiah is a good example of God's foreknowledge and declaring it to us. In 1 Kings 13:2, it reads, "And the man cried against the altar by the word of the Lord and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places and make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you." What's fascinating about this, though, is that this prophecy was made 3 centuries or 300 years before Josiah was even born. So not only did he know of a man that would do these things, he knew the name of the man. You know, it's not like his parents, this was past the time of, you know, living to be 800-900 years. Even his parents likely were not born, you know, but he still knew the name of the man that would do these things, proving again God's foreknowledge to us. And the last one is Cyrus. With verses in Isaiah and Ezra, God predicted that Cyrus would be helpful in rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. In Isaiah 44:28, it says, "Who says of Cyrus," and that's God, God says of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid." The prophecy was written over a century and a half before they would be fulfilled, likely before Cyrus was born as well, so knowing the man by name. In Ezra 1:1, this prophecy is fulfilled, where it says, "In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord of the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing." And in our copies of the word, Ezra is a book that comes before Isaiah, but these events, these prophecies in Isaiah happened, like I said, about a century and a half, about 150 years before the events in Ezra. Again, showing God's foreknowledge and his providence to accomplish his plan. For foreknowledge and free will, this is one where you start getting a lot of objections, a lot of misconceptions, and we'll get into that in the next section as well. But foreknowledge does not negate free will or lessen the guilt of those who do wrong. We can see an example of this in Acts chapter 2, verses 23 and 36, where the Bible says, "This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men." It says you, being the Jews on earth, crucified and killed him. Not, I had him crucified by using you as my puppets so that my plan was fulfilled. No, you had the choice, and you crucified him. Verse 36 says, "Let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus, again, whom you crucified." And this is one of the areas where Calvinism kind of falls apart, and that's one of the things we'll touch on a little bit, because I know Chad just talked about it not too long ago, where, under their theory, it could be said that nobody should feel guilty for sinning because everything was ordained by God, planned by God. And of course, they have a little disclaimer that takes care of that, and we'll see, or that tries to take care of that, and we'll see that later. But under just the plain text of Calvinism, if we sin, if we do wrong, there's no need to feel guilty because we really didn't have a choice. And we can kind of see how off that line of thinking would be. Another quote here by Thyssen, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, but Jehovah has complete knowledge of the past, present, and future. There is a great difference, however, in saying that he knows something will happen and in saying that he wants it to happen. His knowledge of the future, which to humans comes across as foreknowledge, does not detract from or remove man's free will to act as he chooses. Also, God's knowing something before it takes place does not cause it to happen. Free actions do not take place because they are foreseen, but they are foreseen because they will take place. And that's the main distinction there that needs to be made. It's kind of like that chicken before the egg, which comes first kind of scenario, or when I was back in high school, at least for me, it was the car and the job scenario. I have to have a car to make it to a job, but I have to have a job to buy a car. Which one of those takes place? Well, it's very clear in all the examples that we've, number one, seen so far, and will continue to see, that the actions, they are foreseen, but that doesn't cause them to take place. God's foreknowledge is the first thing that happens, but he doesn't then set a line in motion and compel us to then follow through with those actions. A couple examples also from the text that shows this, starting with Adam and Eve, and I wanted to turn to 1 Peter 1:20 first, where it says, he was foreknown, that's Jesus, he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you. Well, one may ask, Well, if God already had devised a plan for the redemption of man from sin, which was certain to be committed, then how could Adam and Eve avoid committing that sin? Or any man. If it wasn't Adam and Eve, how could Cain and Abel? Or just go down the line. How could mankind avoid committing that sin? But again, that's a backwards logic, incorrect logic. Instead, God foresaw that man would sin in every possible scenario. Remember, he sees all possible scenarios that man would sin. Therefore, he put a plan in place that would redeem man from that sin. It wasn't there was a plan made, and so somehow I have to cause man to sin, or else this plan is useless to me. It doesn't work like that. First, he foresees that mankind and his sinful heart will sin. And so God, not wanting all of us to be punished eternally, puts this plan in place and gives us the opportunity to freely choose to follow him. You can think of it also, or I've thought of it, like car insurance. We all have car insurance. We buy car insurance because there is a possibility that we could get into an accident. We want to have that in place to help us through that situation. For our mortal minds, it's only a possibility. It may or may not happen, so we put this plan in place. Well, God knows 100% for sure man will sin, and so he puts this plan in place, a plan that can redeem man and give us hope in this lifetime. Psalm 147, verse 5, which you've already read, says, "Great is our Lord and abundant in power. His understanding is beyond measure." This is one of those concepts that's hard, that the Calvinism and I saw some quotes from atheists, and it doesn't make plain sense on paper, where to us, we see something happen and then we react to it. Well, God sees, and that's kind of how it works for God. He sees that man sins, and then he puts a plan in place. But they always want to look at it backwards. No, God did this. God planned for all of this to happen, and so we had no choice but to live our lives and to commit acts that would cause God's purpose to be fulfilled. And it's just backwards thinking a lot of the times in this scenario. Judas is another good example that I've heard a lot, where people will say, well, he was cursed from the beginning. He didn't stand a chance, right? He was the one that was destined to betray Jesus, and there was nothing he could do to fix that. And his life and his soul, they were just cursed from the beginning. Well, that's not quite the case. Let's turn real quick to John chapter 13. 21 through 27. It's a few verses, but I want to make sure to get all the context here. He says, "After saying these things, Jesus was truly troubled in his spirit and testified, 'Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me.' The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. One of the disciples whom Jesus loved was reclining at the table close to Jesus. So Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So the disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, 'Lord, who is it?' Jesus answered, 'It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it.' So when he dipped the morsel and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, then after he had taken the morsel, Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered into him, into Judas. And we'll come back to that statement. Jesus said to him, 'What you are going to do, do quickly.'" Okay, and we'll stop there. So if people say, well, Judas was cursed, and when they say, well, okay, maybe God didn't make him do it, but right there in verse 27 it says Satan entered him. So Satan made him do it, right? So he still didn't have a choice. He still didn't have control over his own body. He still didn't have a choice over his own actions. Well, let's look at a couple more passages that will nullify this, plus we have an explanation for that. In John, just one page back, in John 12, 3 through 6, we see that Judas kind of didn't have the best reputation, didn't have the best character anyhow. John 12, 3 through 6 reads, "Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance and the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why is this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" And this is the important statement here. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Okay, so Judas was not of the best character, of the best reputation, even before all of this happened. Likewise, we'll turn over to Matthew 26 for those that say, well, Satan made him do it, right? Satan made him carry out this plan. In Matthew's account of these events, Matthew 26, verses 14 through 16. If you see right below that, starting in verses 17, is Matthew's account of the Passover with the disciples, where he proclaims that Judas would be the one that betrays him. Just before that, in verses 14 through 16, it reads, "Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, 'What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?' And they paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he sought an opportunity to betray him." So we can see he had already had this plan in his mind, and started to follow through this plan before Satan, it reads back in John, before Satan had entered him. So Judas was not innocent in all of this. He, by his own free will and by his character, chose to do these evil things. Likewise, Satan entered him. There was an explanation in one of the lectureship books that said this is just under Satan's influence. Satan didn't literally come in, possess his body, take over his actions. This is under Satan's influence, much like a temptation. Satan whispering in his ear, betray Jesus, do these things. But Judas still had the choice. Judas later realizes that he's wrong, goes back and tries to give the money back, and ultimately hangs himself. But I don't ever see in the word where it said that Satan left him. So saying that, it would have had to mean that Satan realized he was wrong because he was still in Judas' body, and I don't think to this day Satan has admitted that he was ever wrong. And that's one of the key components of Satan and the influence that he has over us. All right, I thought I had a lot of material on here, and I do. And I thought I might run out of time, and I definitely will. So we'll skip ahead a little bit. Peter, we all know this one where Jesus said that he will deny him 3 times, and this ends up coming true. Paul and Saul is one that kind of has is not so much of a negative spin as the other ones, but a positive spin. In Galatians, he says, "But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles." And this is another one with one of those kind of foreknowledge and providence mixed, where Paul was presented with this open door to turn from his ways of persecuting Christians and instead evangelize for the Lord. He still had the choice, to go and to change his life and obey the gospel and start preaching the word instead of persecuting those that were doing so. And when God presented this door of opportunity to him, he knew that Saul, who then became Paul, would follow through with this. Yeah, I think I have those backwards, sorry. Would follow through with this plan and choose the right path. Maybe in the possible scenarios, and this is just my mind spinning like a human mind would. Maybe he first tried this plan out, said, if I present this door to this gentleman, named Michael over here, will he go through it and obey my words and become a champion for my cause? And, maybe he didn't. So then he moves over to Saul and saw that he would obey the commands and become a champion for his cause. And it's just all these inner workings that there's so much involved in it that we can't, with our finite knowledge, understand every inner working of it. All right, I'm trying to... We'll probably just skip over this part. A lot of this you've heard before, and I was just going to throw it in here because it does have to do with it. But the Calvinist doctrine, like we said, Chad just had a lot of lessons on that, and we kind of know where they err and where they go wrong. And the important thing there, to foreknow an event is to happen, this is one of the main objections. To foreknow an event is to happen is the same as to actively cause it to happen. In Matthew 25, Jesus is speaking of the final judgment, where he says, all the nations will stand before me, and I will separate the sheep on the right and the goats on the left. And so saying that, Jesus had to know that there would be those that would not obey his word, the goats on the left. But if he knows that and he causes it, then it's in direct contradiction to 1 Timothy 2 and 2 Peter 3, where he basically says, I wish all men to be saved, that no one should be lost. And that would be a direct contradiction under this line of thinking. So we know that one is not the case. Just because he knows of an action does not mean that he causes it. Some pertain to a limited knowledge where God limits his what he wants to know, basically. And the main problem with that would be that first, God would have to know these things and then realize that it's not something he really wants to know, so he has to have some kind of self-imposed amnesia to forget these things. And it's just, a circular argument that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you put it out there. And they point to these passages where God asks a question, not for his purpose, not because he doesn't know. Okay, Adam, where are you in the garden? Or Abraham, when he's asked to offer up Isaac, God didn't, it's not that God didn't know Abraham's faith was strong, and after he was willing to go through with the sacrifice of Isaac, then he knew. These were just accommodating language, and I've heard Chad talk on those before. Another fascinating one to me was the golden calf and Moses, where Aaron makes the golden calf for the people that are grumbling, and God sees this, and God says, I'm going to go down and destroy these people for this sin that they've committed, basically. And Moses intercedes for them, and I guess some people say, or read it in the Word as he talks God down, and he ends up changing his mind. Well, why would God say that he's going to punish them if he knew in the end he wasn't? Well, he did. It's not that he was going to do one thing and then change his mind because of something somebody said, change his mind to a course of action that he didn't know in the first place. Right? It was just, number one, showing Moses as a type of Christ where he can intercede for you, and showing that if you turn from your evil ways, there is still hope and there is just not utter destruction. Wow, that was real fast. There were 4 points. I'll get to them real quick. We won't read all the verses. But 4 application points for us to remember today. Number 1, that God is fully cognizant of our thoughts and attitudes. So it is more important that we watch what we think as well as what we do. Number 2, God knows what we say, so we need to watch our speak. Number 3, God is fully aware of our actions, whether they be good or evil. And this one is the one that brings us hope. He sees and knows the sufferings and sorrows that one may endure in this life, especially for his sake. So he sees all the good things, all the bad things, and all the sufferings that we may go through living our lives for him and proclaiming his name. So I'm sorry I had to rush through the end of it there, but I hope at least I've enjoyed the study and got a lot out of it, and maybe you did as well this morning. Thank you very much.